I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger.
In that single line, Walter White didn't just sum up who he'd become, he declared it. He might have started as a chemistry teacher, but make no mistake, with every step he took up the ladder of his empire, Walt didn't just break bad, he became a monster. A monster with a family he claimed to protect, a fortune he was desperate to build, and a streak of arrogance so blinding it turned every victory into a ticking time bomb. But how does a man go from high school classroom to orchestrating deaths without losing a wink of sleep? And more importantly, in his journey to the top, how many people did he actually kill? And which ones did I miss the first time I watched Breaking Bad? Walter's first kills resulted due to a rather no-way-out situation. He just entered the meth business with his former student Jesse Pinkman. Their first cook was supposed to be simple: set up a shop in an RV, cook the product, and get out. Instead, they found themselves face to face with Crazy 8 and Emilio, two low-level dealers with zero patience and even less mercy. Emilio was furious, convinced Walter was working with the DEA after spotting him at a bust earlier. Tensions rose, threats were thrown, and before Walt could even process what was happening, Emilio and Crazy 8 had guns pointed at him. In a moment of sheer desperation, Walter did what he knew best: chemistry. With a mixture of fear and cold calculation, he whipped up a toxic gas using red phosphorus, and the RV became a death trap. Emilio went down first, suffocating from the gas, collapsing to the floor. Crazy 8, however, became unconscious, but was still alive. Here's where things get darker. Walt had a choice. He could have let Crazy 8 go, but then what? Hand him a coupon for 20% off on his next bash of blue meth and hope for the best? No. A loose end like that doesn't stay loose for long. Walt tied Crazy 8 up in Jesse's basement, giving himself time to think. But thinking didn't help. When he discovered that Crazy 8 had taken a shard from a broken plate, hiding it as a weapon, Walt's hesitation vanished in an instant, as if he'd made his decision a long time ago and was just waiting for an excuse. In a moment, Walt tightened the bike lock around Crazy 8's neck, and Walter White took his first real step into the abyss. And things only went downhill from that step. The man who'd once graded high school chemistry papers was now disposing of a body in a barrel of acid. I can't help but think of Shakespeare's Macbeth standing over Duncan's lifeless body, blood on his hands, knowing he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Macbeth wasn't forced to do it. He chose to. And Walter chose too. After Crazy 8, there came another moment. A moment where Walter stood at the crossroads of life and death, and once again, he had to make a choice. He walked into that apartment and saw Jane choking on her own vomit, but he hesitated. He could have turned her over, called for help, or done anything to save her. But instead, he just stood there, frozen, watching, calculating. And here's the thing. I genuinely believe Walter convinced himself he was doing the right thing. If she dies, Jesse stays under my control. If Jesse stays, the business stays afloat. And if the business stays afloat, my family gets their money. It's like he hit snooze on his conscience over and over again until it was too late. And while Walt was busy doing that, Jane was gone. However, her death wasn't just a loss, it was a spark that would set off a chain reaction, one that Walter wouldn't be able to control. Because when you let someone like Jane Margolis die, the consequences don't just knock politely on your door, they kick it down. Enter Donald Margolis, Jane's father, an air traffic controller, a man who carried the unbearable weight of grief on his shoulders while trying to keep hundreds of lives in the sky safe. We've all felt that kind of grief before, the kind that sits heavy in your chest and turns even the simplest tasks into uphill battles. Maybe it was losing a grandparent who always had candy in their pockets, or a best friend who knew all of your secrets. Maybe it was someone you loved deeply, someone you thought would always be there. That hollow feeling in your chest, that ache that doesn't go away no matter how many distractions you throw at it. Yeah, that's grief. But Donald wasn't given the luxury of collapsing under that grief. His job didn't allow it. He had to show up. He had to focus. Because every button he pushed, every command he gave could mean life or death. But that day, his grief was louder than his focus. His heartbreak was sharper than his instincts. And one missed signal, a fraction of a second, set disaster in motion. Two planes collided in midair, 167 lives gone, and not a single one of them had ever met Walter White. Not a single one of them had anything to do with the meth business. Yet, there they were. Mothers, fathers, children, all caught in the invisible blast radius of Walter's decision to let Jane die. It reminds me of how one bullet fired by Gavrilo Princip didn't just end the life of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It set off a chain reaction that plunged the entire world into chaos. Millions of lives were lost because of a single trigger pull, a single moment that spiraled out of control. Walter might not have been in the control tower, but make no mistake, his fingerprints were all over that crash. And the scariest part, he didn't just accept it, he moved forward with even more ruthlessness. It wasn't long before he made his next kill, the two drug dealers responsible for the death of the younger brother of Andrea Cantillo, Jesse Pinkman's love interest. Thomas was just a kid, a boy forced into a world of violence and addiction, turned into a disposable pawn by two street-level dealers. When he became inconvenient, they silenced him. Now, Jesse wanted revenge. He was angry, reckless, and ready to charge headfirst into danger. But Walt wanted to move with efficiency and planning. No half measures, he said. Later that night, under a flickering street lamp, Walter made his move. He drove his car straight into one dealer without hesitation. He calmly walked up to the other, looked him dead in the eyes, and pulled the trigger. Now, I've often thought about this scene. One question that always bothered me was, what was the motive behind Walt's actions? Did he really care about Thomas? But as I was rewatching the show, one thing struck me. Walt wasn't playing a righteous avenger. No, he was simply trying to keep Jesse alive. Because he knew that if he let Jesse walk up to those two drug dealers, he might get himself killed, and their whole business would come crashing down. So, Walt took that burden upon himself. But if Walter White's empire was a throne built on bodies, Gail Botica was the sacrifice that cemented his crown. Gail wasn't dangerous. He wasn't a threat. Honestly, the guy probably just wanted to drink some oolong tea, hum along to Major Tom, and perfect Walt's recipe in peace. But Gus had other plans. Gail was insurance, a replacement for Walter in case he became too much trouble. Walter realized something chilling. If Gail lives, Walter dies. But he couldn't do it himself. Instead, he handed Jesse the gun and said the words that sealed both of their fates. You know what you have to do. I can't even imagine what was going through Jesse's mind at that moment. Standing at Gail's door, gun in hand, looking back into the wide, terrified eyes of a man who'd done nothing to deserve this. But Jesse pulled the trigger.
You don't have to do this.
And while Jesse was the one pulling the trigger, that was Walter's kill. It's like those wartime generals who sit on their polished offices, giving orders while soldiers bleed on the battlefield. Walter didn't pull the trigger, but he loaded the gun, pointed it, and gave the command. Gail's death wasn't just tragic, it was a turning point. With Gail gone, Walter had officially declared war. He wasn't just a player in the game anymore, he was gunning for the throne. And there was only one man standing in his way. Gus Fring, the bossman himself. Gus wasn't just another drug lord. He was a businessman, a tactician, and one of the most methodical villains television has ever seen. But Walt wasn't playing chess anymore. He flipped the entire board. We've all fantasized about telling off our boss, maybe flipping a desk or walking out to the Eye of the Tiger blasting in the background. But Walter, he strapped a bomb to his boss's biggest enemy, Hector Salamanca, orchestrated a nursing home explosion, and then casually strolled into the corner office like, yeah, I run this now. Walt played Gus's one weakness, his need for revenge. He knew that Gus's hatred for Hector Salamanca burned hotter than any caution he'd ever shown. Walt played on that hate, knowing it would cloud Gus's razor-sharp instincts, make him step closer and, just for a moment, drop his guard. And in that moment, Walter struck. In one of the most iconic moments in Breaking Bad, Hector sat in his wheelchair, his finger hovering over that belt. And then, boom. Gus walked out of that room, adjusted his tie one last time, and collapsed, half his face missing, but somehow still composed. But here's the twisted part. Walter didn't just kill Gus, he became him. But ruling an empire comes with paranoia, and paranoia always comes with targets. One of those targets was Mike Ehrmantraut. Mike was the fixer, the cleaner, the guy who knew where all the bodies were buried because he probably buried most of them himself, and that's exactly why Walt wanted to eliminate him. Their final confrontation by the riverbank was like two predators sizing each other up. Mike wanted out, Walter wanted control, and in a moment of frustration, pride, and sheer stupidity, Walter pulled the trigger. The worst part, he didn't even need to kill Mike. I just realized, it could have all been avoided. Well, yeah, Walt, that's like realizing your house is on fire after you've already poured gasoline on the couch. Mike might have been a threat to Walt, but his death wasn't strategic. It wasn't calculated. It was pure ego. Mike's death was a tantrum, a moment of uncontrolled pride and anger. But Walt wasn't going to make that mistake again. When it came to eliminating the next set of threats, he planned every second, every move, every death. 10 men, 10 loose ends scattered across different prisons, each one a potential witness, a crack in Walter's empire. Walt didn't hesitate. He handed Jack Welker and his neo-Nazi crew a hit list, nodded once, and stepped back. The massacre that followed wasn't chaotic, it was surgical. Showers turned into execution chambers, libraries became ambush zones, and in under 2 minutes, silence fell across 10 prison cells. And here's the thing, Walter probably slept like a baby that night. Up until that point, Walt had faced some close calls, but he'd always managed to come out on top. The prison massacre was Walter White at his most ruthless, a man playing God with a hit list and a stopwatch. But empires don't collapse in grand explosions, they unravel, thread by thread. One of those threads was Lydia Rodart's Quail, paranoid Lydia, sipping her chamomile tea like it could wash away her sins. However, Walt was done with loose ends. Ricin became his signature, an elegant, silent death. If Walt ever wrote a cookbook, one recipe would probably read 1 cup of tea, 1 pinch of ricin, and a whole lot of vengeance. But tea parties were just the appetizer. The final showdown was a full-course meal. After Jack's gang had kidnapped Jesse, Walt made a choice. And not just any choice, it was his final gambit. His last play on a board littered with blood, betrayal, and broken promises. But let's be clear, Walt wasn't just there to save Jesse, or maybe he was. However, his main focus was to end it all. The meth business, the empire, the chaos, all of it. Because at this point, Walt wasn't fighting to win anymore. He was fighting to finish. And he did it in true Walter White fashion, by turning science into destruction. He rigged an M60 machine gun to turn the Nazi compound into Swiss cheese, the very gang that once helped him put an end to 10 witnesses. In one final act of science meets violence, Walter outsmarted, out-engineered, and outgunned them all. When the dust settled, Jack Welker was dead, Todd Alquist was gone, and Jesse was free. However, Walt didn't get away clean. A stray bullet had found its mark, and Walter White, the king, the emperor, the danger, was bleeding out. But here's the thing, Walter didn't die scared. He didn't die desperate, and even after leading such a ruthless life, he didn't have any regrets. He died content, surrounded by the hum of machinery, the gleam of stainless steel, in the empire he'd built with his own 2 hands. It's like Napoleon at Waterloo, standing on the ruins of everything he built, knowing it was all over. And then he fell. The curtain closed, the danger was gone, and the legend of Walter White was complete.